Good afternoon, lecturers, Dr. Shivani and Dr. Malachi, and fellow classmates. My name is Dominique Montiel, and today I will be presenting on Saleh bin Jonat's poem, Haramska Rum, focusing my analysis on the way the work questions and challenges the institutionalization of religion. Before I begin any discussion on the poem itself, I will now briefly outline the author's biographical info and situate him in his corresponding Malaysia. Saleh bin Jonat was born in 1942 Malacca, though he moved to Australia in his youth as a Colombo Plan scholar in order to earn his degree at the University of Adelaide. He married and fathered children, remaining in Australia until 1973 when he made his return to Malaysia and started lecturing at University Malaya until 1983. So the 70s and 80s are the era and the years in which he produced, but not published, most of his works, including the collection Sajak Sajak Saleh, in which Haramska Rum is featured. Situating him in this time of ideological changes in Malaysia helps understand the issues with which Saleh is especially uncomfortable and against which he aims his barbed poetry, as clearly put by academic Andrew Hoxsoon. The NEP had just been implemented in 1971, solidifying the status of Bumiputras as Malaysia's dominant race and other ethnicities, Chinese, Indians, etc., as minorities. That same year, the constitutionalized amendment was passed, making it illegal to question the national language, which was Bahasa Melayu. So in the dawn of these socio-political shifts, Saleh's work replies to this post-unquestionability. He is characterized as a rebel, and with reason, his poetry being heavy with commentary on a variety of subjects: the Bumiputra status, sexual repression, the national rejection of English, and last but not least, the institutionalization of sacredness, and in Malaysia's case, Islam. This is a quote that is written by an academic that was exploring Saleh's work and is very, very relevant in what I will be discussing in this presentation. In his witty and ironic manner, Jonat unapologetically teases many of the nation's sacred cows. He's particularly concerned about the creeping institutionalization of religion. So here is Haramska Rum, which is the poem that I will be referring to. And when I refer to specific examples, I will be jumping back to this slide so that you guys can see it in the actual poem. So before we go into any deeper discussion, it is important to make clear that Saleh in this poem is referring to is the institutionalization of religion as opposed to Islam itself. So it is really important to have that in mind. And we can see that with the following terminology. So in the poem, he uses terms like Muslim and Malay as a joined identity, and he also uses the terms Bumis and pride as a race. Now, in a poem concerned mainly about religion, the fact that he's using these national terms and sort of boxing in Muslim and Malay into one identity can point towards this interchangeability between national and spiritual identity. So in this sense, we see that he's in fact referring to, and we can see here, in stanza 3 he says we're Muslims and terribly Malay. Stanza 4 he says redeem our pride as a race. Stanza 5 he says Bumis, and stanza 6 he closes off with saying Muslim and Malay. So with this terminology, he is pointing his critique to the problematics of this merge between national and spiritual identity, rather than directing his irony and satire towards the religion itself, as we will see later on in a more closer discussion in the following slides. So this terminology, although subtle, is key in identifying Saleh's agenda. And it should be clear that what he's trying to get at and to challenge and to satire is this compacting of religious identity with a national one. And with this, he's offering a definition of what sacred should be. So by critiquing a merged spiritual and national identity, he's offering up a definition of sacred that calls towards a spirituality that is unmediated, and is more to do with the individual's intimate relationship with the religion rather than to what governmental bodies and institutions have said and pointed towards what should be followed. Now, to begin this discussion, I will sort of look at what the poem is um, satirically defining as haram. So we see here in stanza 1, the poem says, drinking, gambling, lying, bribery, and all kinds of whoring too, all of them perfectly okay. And then in stanza 3, we see, but that's terribly untouchable, referring to consuming pork. And yes. So this notion of haram as concerned mainly with eating pork and not with the drinking, gambling, lying, and bribery and whoring, um, sort of points towards this idea that institutionalized religion is inciting a disconnection from true Islamic values, which point towards things like drinking and gambling and whoring as being haram, um, and promoting a sense of religiosity that, rather than being based on inherently Islamic beliefs, is based more on a common dislike, which is this taboo of not consuming pigs, or as he says in the last stanza, we hate pigs. So, onto this idea of hogs and hogwash and swines, all throughout the poem, there is this sort of pork-like terminology being used. We can see here in the first stanza, he says, and to hog, it's all not taboo. And then in the fourth stanza, he says whole hog, boars, swines. So what really is the purpose of this terminology? So obviously we can see that this terminology can be considered offensive or profane by a certain population, for example, Malays or Muslims. So really, what is the author trying to get at by using these terms? There are alternate interpretations. So one could be that the overuse of this language manages to actually reveal the profanity that's not the language itself, but rather the reliance of this convention for religious identity. Um, it could also be the author's attempt to sort of, by using this terminology constantly throughout the poem, to normalize and sort of strip these terms and of its taboo and of its sort of connotation. Um, and when we look at the last stanzas, we see it is mentioned in the fifth stanza, it's hogwash what those swine say, that we boomies mount piggyback like a pack of boars, hacking up our way up the slippery slope of success. So here, the poem is actually directly using pork-like terminology to describe the boomies. So with this, the point of the hoggish language could be to reveal the uncleanliness of the individual that relies on this for spiritual identity, and sort of rejects not cheating and bribing and drinking. So this language can reveal the uncleanliness of that individual rather than the animal. So by using this terminology, he is sort of in an ironic way pointing towards not really the uncleanliness of the pork, but rather of the individual that falls into this spirituality and institutionalized trap. So after discussing these explorations of the poem of profanity and what it means to be profane and what is sacred, um, it is quite revealing to compare it to definitions of the sacred and profane given by Giorgio Agamben in his work Profanations. So it according to Agamben's Profanations, sacred or religious were the things that in some way belonged to the gods, while profane is the term for something that was once sacred or religious but was manipulated into something that now belongs to man. So, in this sense, when we recognize this definition, the poem can be perceived to imply two layers of meaning. One, that prayer and the religious tradition of withholding from pork consumption, and also um, a trip to the Holy of Holies, as he mentions in stanza 2, that all of these things that were once sacred and spiritual practices have been transformed into a sort of religious insurance. So if we see here this stanza, the second stanza, where he says, all sins of course, but nothing really a trip to the Holy of Holies cannot fix for eternity. God blesses man's enterprise. We can see here that there's a sort of allusion to these things becoming religious insurance, a sort of nationalized tool by which individuals that may cheat and lie and bribe, etc., can maintain their spiritual status. So, with this, there is a suggestion that it is this version of religiosity that is profane. Furthermore, the understanding of sacred as godlike and profane as manipulated into belonging to man inherently points to the institutionalization of religion. So, by taking values and beliefs that are meant to be spiritually understood and making them something concrete, like an institution um, or a governmental body, we can see that the poem is sort of implying that this taints the religious with actual profanity, not the profanity perceived in Jonet's language, just which could be offensive, but rather this idea of using religion and manipulating religion, something that is godlike and spiritual and should not be manipulated by man for alternate purposes. So this leads me to sort of a discussion on, well, profanity to what end? Why is profanity and sacredness being discussed in this poem? Um, when we look at everything that we have discussed, we can see that profanity and sacredness, in Saleh's eyes, can be seen to be in a sort of symbiotic relationship um, rather than being opposing terms. Here's actually a quote from an essay of a critic that was also examining Saleh. He says, rather, Saleh's poems persistently reinforce the complementary nature of both spheres, the profane and the sacred. So here we see that there is a sort of calling into question of what profane and sacred really are, and sort of looking past what institutions and governments have pointed at being profane and sacred. And there is the poem implies that the individual should question these things and sort of self-explore spiritually what profanity and what sacred means, rather than falling into the trap of simply following what a government or an institution says is profane or sacred in terms of religion. So we can see here that actually this poem that is like quite controversial and could be quite offensive for some people is not being profane for shock value, or not using profanity for shock value, but actually using it as a means of inciting interpretive reaction and elucidating what real sacredness is versus what the institutionalized version has become. So it's calling into question this relationship between the spiritual individual and the institution that manages this religion, sort of implying that a religion should not be tainted with institutions or man, but rather be an internal exploration of spirituality where profanity and sacredness can be questioned, and sort of can be encountered to be complementary terms. So, in conclusion, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, what Saleh is being critical of is not really the religion, is not Islam itself, but the way in which it has been manipulated, and used by man. As we can see from the poem, there is a sort of implication of religion being used by man and used by institutions of power for an alternate purpose. Um, and so by sort of employing satire and irony and being really critical of this, the poem sort of the poem suggests that religion is such a spiritual and sacred and individual thing, um, that it would be profane and misleading to use it and manipulate it. Thank you all very, very much for your attention. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to email me. I will surely respond. And also, I would just like to mention before wrapping up that I'm really humbled. I'm the only non Malaysian student in the class, and I am really grateful that I have the opportunity to discuss subjects that the rest of my fellow classmates are quite well versed in. So thank you for the opportunity of letting me sort of give my 2 cents on this. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you.